Comic book characters are modern mythology. Their stories are archetypes, repeating patterns that occur not just in their fantastical lives, but in ours as well. As such, these mythological stories can become our teachers, just as ancient mythology was used as a way to reveal to us the world in which we lived.
The rites of passage is a movie genre where a character goes through a difficult transformation from one stage of life to the next. But it also chronicles a sort of life event that we all go through at various points. Tonight, we're going to see what we can learn about the rites of passage in the film Spider-Man: Far From Home. We will then compare this event to other teachings in occult philosophy, such as thresholds and the death and rebirth process known as samsara.
In the comics that preceded the films, Spider-Man was usually described as Marvel's most popular superhero, and Marvel's principle was to always depict their superheroes as fallible, real-life people. Yes, they had superpowers, but they struggle in their real lives just as we do, which Stan Lee always said made them more relatable. In almost all iterations of the character, Spider-Man is a fun-loving young person who has trouble balancing his personal life with his growing newfound responsibilities as a superhero. His superhero life might be a great joy time to time, he might even excel at it, but he's always messing up things in his teenage Peter Parker life. Because he can't get on a stable foundation in his personal life, his superhero life collapses as a result. I've been doing a lot of thinking about archetypes lately, and how superheroes can represent those archetypes. An archetype is a universal pattern that crosses all cultural boundaries and can be seen throughout all of art, literature, and mythology. According to Jungian psychology, there are 12 mythic archetypes. And Peter Parker would be best categorized as the archetype of Hermes the Fool. The Fool is an enthusiastic, free spirit. He is playful and adventurous. The Fool is a man who is young inside, someone who believes life should be fun and enjoy himself. The Fool lives in the moment and tends to be very spontaneous. Of the negative characteristics of the Fool type, the Fool can be terrified of commitment. He can pick up and disappear for long stretches of time. This is because he fears losing his freedom, and he fears not being able to save those he loves when they are in trouble. The Spider-Man stories are universal because, metaphorically, his spider power stands for that innate talent or natural ability that we all have inside of us that we wish to use in the world. But if we can't balance our regular lives, we won't get to use those gifts as they are intended. In order to be able to take on our greatest challenges, we have to have stability in our personal lives, in relationships, and in basic responsibilities. For Peter Parker, he can't quite ever balance his personal life. As a young person on the rise, represented by the Fool archetype, he hasn't quite learned that life lesson yet, and that will be his lesson to learn.
And now that we understand the archetype of Spider-Man, we can better understand his behavior within the context of his most recent film, Far From Home, as he traverses his rites of passage.
In Spider-Man: Homecoming, Peter Parker, recently beset with superpowers, eagerly wanted responsibility in the adult world.
Feel like I could be doing more. I'm just curious when the next real mission's gonna be.
But now in this film, that situation is reversed. With the death of Tony Stark, his mentor, Peter finds that he lives in a new world he wasn't ready for. This world is pressuring him to move on to a bigger role than he thinks he can handle. That categorizes this film as a rites of passage movie. In all rites of passage movies, the protagonist struggles to transition from one phase of life to the next and resists the change.
I don't really want to talk to Nick Fury. Why?
Can Peter go from small-time, neighborhood-saving Spider-Man to now a worldwide, Earth-saving hero and replacement of Tony Stark? That's a much bigger, full-time responsibility than a 16-year-old kid ever expected. And even if he could, how can he do this and not have to give up his normal teenager life, having fun with his friends, hanging out during the summer, and not risk losing the girl he likes before she's stolen away by that jerk Brad? And as rites of passage stories go, Because of his resistance to the life change, he chooses the wrong way of coping with the problem. And the avoidance of that problem creates an even greater problem later in the story.
Now that is an Avengers level threat.
There are 3 stages to a rites of passage story. Number 1, a life problem arises that you don't want to take on. We may fear it, or it may be something that we just really don't want to go through. Stage 2, we choose the wrong way of coping with the problem. This may include denial, resistance, avoidance, frustration, anger, breakdowns, bargaining. Any of the 5 stages of grief may occur. And in stage 3, finally we realize we need to let go of the resistance and do what is necessary to embrace the new life, or the new way of being.
It feels like it belongs to someone else.
If we look over into another corner of the Marvel Universe, a rites of passage story is also taking place with our Captain America characters. In Falcon and the Winter Soldier, Sam has a life problem. He is reluctant to accept his new role as the next Captain America.
Why didn't you take up the mantle?
He chose to give away the shield that was given to him by Steve Rogers in retirement.
You're new Captain America.
In another example, Stephen Strange has a life problem. As a gifted neurosurgeon, he was at the top of his game and looking for the next great challenge for his career, when suddenly a terrible accident left him unable to pursue that path again. He chooses the wrong way of coping with the problem by refusing to accept the change and attacking everyone in his life, including the people that are trying to help him. The rites of passage stories are about crossing life thresholds. A threshold is a change from one identity in life to the next. Superhero or regular man, these life passages are great challenges for us. Our metamorphosis is not guaranteed, for it is true that some caterpillars fail to become butterflies. Like there are archetypal characters, there are also archetypal stories. And the rites of passage is one of those archetypal stories that is a foundational form of our world.
I'm gonna tell her how I feel. And then 6, hopefully she tells me she feels the same way.
It's also fitting and hilarious that the film's B story is also a rites of passage story. Here, he's trying to make himself worthy of a girlfriend and earn a relationship for the first time. And he's completely lovesick over it. A rival classmate is vying for her affection and is attempting deliberately to sabotage him.
I know you're trying to get with MJ, it's obvious. But I like her too.
He's concocted a very complex 6-point plan that has to go right in order for it to work to win her affection. Therefore, he's going through a more traditional adolescent rites of passage. That's a life event that we can all relate to, and the type of life challenge he feels prepared for at this point. So, Peter's internal conflicts are all throwing off his game, and as a result of the stress, he's lost his most natural power, his spider sense. This is perfectly set up early in the film when Aunt May throws him a banana and he fails to dodge it.
So what's up? You can dodge bullets but not bananas?
No, I just really need this vacation. I need a break.
Peter struggles in the first half of the film to accept the bigger responsibility he's been given, and he ends up by the midpoint trying to abandon it altogether. Because of his mistakes, mishandling Edith and mishandling Brad, he feels that as a kid he just can't handle this big transition, and he just doesn't trust himself anymore. He tries to push off the responsibility to someone else.
The world needs the next Iron Man. And it's not gonna be me. I mean, I'm a 16-year-old kid from Queens. It needs to be an adult with some experience and that's good like Tony Stark, like you.
Then, in the second half, we have a midpoint shift. By avoiding the responsibility he feared he couldn't handle, he inadvertently gave the world a bigger problem with Mysterio, now attempting to pose as that superhero he was supposed to become. Yet, unlike Tony Stark, he won't be doing it with good intentions. He'll be deceiving the public for personal gain and harming the world instead of helping it.
You made your choice, and all you had to do was step aside.
We may derive from this moment is that if you don't take the responsibility that's yours, if you don't step up to your position in the world, someone else will.
I mean, if I'm gonna be the next Iron Man, I need to save the world from an Avengers level threat.
And they might not be the right person for it. For Sam Wilson, he chose to give away the shield that was given to him by Steve Rogers in retirement. And unfortunately, the shield ends up in the wrong hands of a morally unrighteous person. He has held the identity of Sam Wilson the Falcon for a very long time, and now he has to pass through the threshold to the identity of Sam Wilson Captain America. An identity passage can be very challenging to cross because we often have strong resistance to change who we think we are. Will people even accept the new me? Am I fooling myself? For those that are honest, like Sam Wilson, the passing of the torch is not so easy, because they must honestly evaluate the depth of themselves to discover if they are truly deserving. There are several common types of rites of passage stories: the adolescent passage, the midlife passage, the separation passage, the addiction passage, the death passage, and the spiritual passage.
You are just a scared little kid in a sweatsuit.
We are now at the bad guys close in moment of the story. Peter attempts to make up for his mistake and stop the villain, but he keeps being fooled and can't see past the advanced illusions cast by Mysterio. Peter is defeated and reeling from his mistakes. After waking up after a night in prison, Peter meets up with Happy Hogan.
How can I relax when I messed up so bad?
Peter finally breaks down, expressing his dread in coping with the problem of becoming the next Tony Stark.
The whole world is asking who's gonna be the next Iron Man. I don't know if that's me, Happy. I'm not Iron Man.
And in accepting the responsibility of being as big a superhero as Iron Man. Now, before the character will reach the third stage of the rites of passage, he may go through all 5 stages of grief. Perhaps not the case for Spider-Man, but for a character like Doctor Strange it is. The 5 stages of grief do not just apply to death, but can apply to any life transition, and may include any form of personal loss, such as the loss of a job or income, a major rejection, the end of a relationship or divorce, drug addiction, the onset of a disease, and even minor losses. When a threshold comes, life is saying, it's time to change. It's time to move on. We are meant to change. However, when a threshold comes, people will lean towards resistance of that change. They will choose self-preservation over painful transformation. However, the path of self-preservation, while seemingly the easier path, can be the path of misery. For Peter Parker, becoming Spider-Man was a relatively easy passage to go through. It was seen as exciting and fun and a way to attain a new kind of freedom for his archetype. But now being Spider-Man is a whole different ballgame. Being Spider-Man is a much bigger life threshold for Peter Parker to cross. That's because being Spider-Man is not just for him alone. It is exceedingly difficult to give your life to something, to give your life over to a higher cause. That is a huge threshold for anyone to cross. With great power comes higher responsibility.
You're not Iron Man. You're never gonna be Iron Man. Nobody could live up to Tony. Not even Tony.
At the end of the second act, Peter has a meeting with his new mentor figure, Happy Hogan. Essentially, Happy tells Peter that despite Tony Stark being one of a kind, Tony made a lot of mistakes. And so basically, it's okay to make errors, because our errors are our teachers. And don't try to be Tony Stark, because you can't. Instead, try to do you, because that's who you were chosen to be.
The one thing that he did that he didn't second guess was picking you.
When Peter hears from Stark's best friend that Tony believed in him over all others, and it's okay to make mistakes, he finally accepts that he is capable and deserving of his higher role in the world. He regains his certainty in his capability to be responsible, and he is re-empowered to take on the challenge before him. In the ancient cultures of the world, the process of life change was honored and revered. This is the origin of what some refer to as the death and rebirth cycle, or samsara, which is defined as the cyclicality of all life, matter, and existence. When we go through a life threshold, there is a part of us that needs to die so that a new part of us can be born. For the death and rebirth process is an archetypal event. We will not die merely once, but will die at many points throughout our lifetimes. To comprehend and accept this cycle as a natural process, we will make important growth in our lives. Ancient cultures understood that every ascent begins with a descent, and they encoded this message into our ancient stories and mythologies. We may find archetypal symbolism of this event in the tarot, the death card, Often feared and misunderstood, in actuality, it symbolizes the end of a major phase or aspect of your life that you realize is no longer serving you, opening up the possibility of something far more valuable and essential. You must close one door to allow another door to open. If you resist the necessary endings, you may experience pain, both emotionally and physically. Now, let's look at the spiritual meaning of the symbol of the spider itself. In ancient societies, both the spider and its web were symbolic in a number of ways. Because spiders are creatures that can weave intricate webs, they were associated with creativity and the power of manifestation. The number of legs of a spider is 8, and it also has 8 eyes, which in numerology, the number 8 represents infinity. Thus, the number 8 has a meaning that suggests cycles, suggesting the passage of time and evolution through the death and rebirth process of life. It is for this reason that spiders have been a symbol for the death and rebirth process, which is synchronistically perfect as it's the very theme of this video. A spider crawling on you stands for cyclic progression, death and rebirth, protection and power over destiny. The banana scene is thus echoed in the final conflict when Peter, now re-empowered to be himself, responds perfectly to his spider sense in the final illusion posed by Mysterio. This time, he senses the illusions with his intuition and exposes and defeats Mysterio using his natural given ability. In the end, Peter has realized the necessity of his greater responsibility in the world. He is no longer fighting against the truth inside of himself. And so, he has passed the third and final stage of the rites of passage, acceptance of his new life. He has leveled up and has become the next version of himself. And for his rites of passage in the Beast story, turns out he didn't have to do that 6-point plan that kept being a disaster. He just had to be himself. Turns out they had a natural attraction all along, and MJ was really watching him the whole time because she just liked him.
No, for real, I'm good. I'm actually really fine.
Let's go. Where are your bags? Oh, right, they got blown up.
Yeah.
And in this moment, we can infer a metaphor, for he has successfully passed through his death and rebirth process into his new life without that baggage that was previously holding him down in his old life. In this film, Spider-Man was going through several rites of passage at the same time. The adolescent passage with the attempt at a relationship initiation. He is also going through a death passage with the passing of his father figure. And he's also going through an identity passage with the death of his old identity and the birth of a new identity, one of more responsibility in the world. In both stories, our heroes learn that without taking on these new roles, there is a great energy offset in the world. By denying their presence, they come to see the forces for good become tilted in the wrong direction. By the end, they both finally realize the passing of the life threshold is not something merely wanted or decided, but needed. It is not a choice to make, but a necessity. Finally, there is acceptance that it's not a choice anymore at all. It is necessary that we all go through various passages in life. If you look back, you can see there one day came a time when you had to make a big life change that you didn't want to make. Life was pressing you to change, but you resisted the change, only to finally come out on the end, realizing that change was inevitable. It was only after it ended that you then had the chance to look back and realize the change was also good for you. And now, you're thankful that you passed through it. In 2019, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, with co-author David Kessler, suggested a 6th stage of grief. That is to say that after a life passage, we may come to realize that despite the painful nature of the transition that we tried to avoid at all costs, had the change not occurred, we would have not ended up in a better place in some way that was completely unexpected and unpredicted by us. In this way, we realized later that a greater purpose was behind the change for us. And this is the final stage, meaning. In conclusion, this places Peter Parker as the archetype of the fool. In an archetypal story known as the Rites of Passage, which is about going through the archetypal life event known as the death and rebirth process, represented symbolically by the death card in the tarot, wearing the animal emblem of the spider, a symbol of cyclic progression, death, and rebirth in numerology. The archetypes of our character are not fixed upon us forever. They are more like roles we play at certain venues in life. If we pass successfully through a major threshold and become a new version of ourselves, we may in turn take on the attributes of a brand new archetype.
In the next episode of Secret Teachings, we're going to dive further into Spider-Man Far From Home and discuss the themes of how to perceive lies and deceptions and the allegory of the spider sense.
Subscribe and like this video to stay informed on their arrival.